What does it really take to see someone clearly? Not through the lens of politeness, not through the blur of emotion, but with the clarity of someone who looks beyond what's said, beyond what's shown. What's required to strip someone down to their essence, without relying on their backstory, without falling for their justifications, without being seduced by their charm? Maybe it's not intelligence in the traditional sense. Maybe it's simply the courage to accept that most people aren't who they say they are, they're what they do when no one's scripting their actions. The ability to read someone isn't a mystical gift or some overdeveloped sense of empathy. It's a strategic skill, a way of seeing the human being without the decoration, without the moral makeup, without the fog of wishful thinking. For Machiavelli, this kind of vision wasn't harsh, it was necessary. Because once you stop believing that people act out of principle, you begin to understand that they act out of fear, desire, and a need to preserve whatever gives them a sense of worth. And in that moment, reading someone becomes sharp, unsettling, but real. What we call virtue is often just fear in a prettier outfit. Integrity can be a polished way to avoid conflict. Kindness, a self-protective maneuver. Sacrifice? Sometimes nothing more than a subtle transaction to buy validation without looking like you're asking for it. How many of the actions we admire are built on hidden self-interest? How many noble words are just attempts to be seen as righteous, consistent, or superior? The ones who truly know how to observe don't stop at the speech, they look for the cracks. The tiny break between what someone claims and what they unconsciously repeat. Because that's where truth lives, in the fracture, not the facade. There's an unavoidable discomfort in seeing people this way, because it forces us to let go of the comfort that appearances offer. You can't say, he's a good guy, just because he smiles. You can't say, she's trustworthy, just because she speaks with confidence. Listening isn't enough anymore. You have to interpret. You have to study the way someone changes their tone around people they admire, or how they shrink around those they fear. You watch their gestures, their silences, the tiny tremors of ego when something threatens their self-image. This isn't about being suspicious of everything. It's about no longer believing that everything that glitters is honest. Politeness isn't always respect. Sincerity isn't always transparency. Sometimes the most honest thing a person says is what they didn't mean to reveal. From this perspective, intelligent people aren't the most educated, the most emotionally expressive, or even the most compassionate. They're the ones who know how to look. They've learned to separate what someone wants to project from who they actually are. They no longer mistake affection for evidence. Because affection idealizes, it softens edges, it edits out what hurts to see. But strategic intelligence feeds on what slips through the cracks. What someone repeats without knowing. Their contradictions. Their shifts in posture. The way they demand respect while quietly degrading those who can't fight back. These tiny, sometimes awkward details reveal more than 1,000 speeches about authenticity. The real reading of another human being begins not when you judge their intentions, but when you study their patterns. No one can fake it forever. Coherence collapses when desire takes over. When fear walks in. When power shows up. That's when a person is finally revealed. Because in the presence of fear, power, or temptation, we all revert to our most primal emotional architecture. The way we treat the weak. The way we handle unexpected admiration. The way we behave when we know we can manipulate without consequence. These things speak louder than any personal history or ethical declaration. There's something almost cruel about learning to see like this. Because it shatters the myth that people are fundamentally good. It forces us to accept that the masks people wear are so convincing, even they start to believe they're real. But there's also freedom in this kind of perception. The freedom not to be manipulated by appearances. The freedom to choose who gets access to you, not based on what they claim to be, but based on what they reveal when no one's watching. And that's the greatest power of someone who knows how to read others. They don't need you to confess. They just let you be, because eventually, you'll show exactly who you are. Reading people, then, becomes an art shaped by disappointment. Not because you resign yourself to the worst in others, but because you learn to see without unnecessary illusions. There's no room for heartbreak when you never put blind faith on the table. What's left is clarity. And with clarity comes choice. The power to decide who belongs around you, who deserves to be heard, who earns the benefit of the doubt, and who doesn't. Not out of judgment, but from deep understanding. Maybe that's why, in a world where everyone's busy performing who they wish they were, real power belongs to those who aren't seduced by the show. Because when you see clearly, you don't need to control anyone. You just need to understand them. And that kind of understanding, cold, calm, surgical, is what sets apart the mind trained to read hidden souls. Is it a lonely path? Probably. The more you understand people, the harder it gets to idealize them. But it's also a powerful path. Because when you stop filtering the world through your hopes and start seeing it for what it is, your choices become cleaner, sharper. You bleed less, not because you avoid involvement, but because you no longer hand your trust to a version of someone that never truly existed. So no, it's not about becoming cynical for sport or suspicious by default. It's about learning how to see. And seeing, in the Machiavellian sense, isn't just looking outward. It's dismantling the comforting lies we build to feel safe around others. It's recognizing that most people don't act out of principle, but out of what they feel they have to protect. That morality, for many, is not a compass, it's a shield. And the only way to navigate through all that smoke and mirrors is to train your eyes until they're immune to the charm of appearances. The world isn't divided into good people and bad ones. It's divided between those who think they're virtuous and those who've accepted that everyone, at some point, acts to protect something. What separates them isn't morality. It's how aware they are of the game they're playing. And only the ones who know the hidden rules can play without being moved like pawns. Only those who've truly learned to read others stop being read by default. And in that space, where naivety dies and lucidity is born, begins what we could call real Machiavellian intelligence. Knowing how to read someone isn't about predicting their future. It's about understanding the past they carry without ever speaking about it. Every repeated gesture, every unnecessary silence, every subtle shift in how they respond to different types of power, it all forms an emotional map that quietly reveals what truly drives them. And that map isn't drawn with words. It's drawn with contradictions. The key is to let people contradict themselves long enough, not to judge them, but to see just how hard they're working to hide what they really want. Most people don't live from their truth, they live from their need to be accepted. They don't seek internal consistency, they seek external approval. That's why when someone acts generously, it's rarely pure virtue. Most of the time, they do it because they want to be seen as generous. Because they need their identity to make sense through other people's eyes. That's when you can read them, when what they do matches too perfectly with what they want you to believe about them. The person who acts from conviction doesn't need to make a show of it, doesn't need to convince. They just do what they do and move on. But the one who's acting out of fear, of not being liked, of not seeming good, always leaves behind a trail of overcompensation. And that's the clue. There's a kind of intelligence you don't learn in any classroom, the kind that knows how to spot the difference between emotional truth and performance. This intelligence doesn't need facts or theories, just presence. Because once you've really learned to watch, you become immune to the charm of first impressions. You know that authenticity takes time. It needs pressure. It needs contradiction. No one shows who they truly are in moments of peace. They reveal themselves in conflict and chaos. That's why, instead of rushing to trust, the one who sees clearly waits. Not because they're paranoid, but because they understand that people bloom into who they are only when they're out of control. What's fascinating about a Machiavellian lens isn't the coldness, it's the precision. It doesn't romanticize. It doesn't condemn. It just understands. And once you understand, judgment becomes unnecessary. You don't need to label someone as good or bad. You just look at what they protect, what they want, what they fear. Because every defense is a confession. Every emotional tactic reveals a wound. And every mask, no matter how polished, always lets a sliver of truth slip through. All it takes to catch it is to wait, to stay quiet, and more than anything, to look without needing the other person to be what you hoped for. Strangely enough, the hardest people to read are usually the ones trying the hardest to appear transparent. The ones who wear openness like a costume, emotional, honest, authentic, are often deeply invested in managing a self-image. And that image acts like a filter, a layer between what they really want and what they allow themselves to show. Anyone who reveals themselves too quickly probably isn't showing you their true self. They're showing you the character they've perfected to survive being seen. That's why the real reading happens in the unguarded moments, in the eyes that shift when a subject gets too close, in the tension that creeps in when you touch a nerve, in the enthusiasm that feels a little too forced when they try to convince you of who they are. And here's the brutal truth. The moment someone tries too hard to prove they're consistent, they've already admitted they're not. What's someone trying to protect when they obsess over appearing coherent? What part of themselves falls apart without constant validation? Machiavellian thinking isn't about cynicism, it's about clarity. To see that even noble actions can come from complicated motives isn't to devalue them. It's to free your eyes from naivete. Because even the purest acts are born from context, from frameworks of belief, from need. And understanding that helps you relate to people from a place that's grounded, not idealized. One of the biggest mistakes we make in trying to know someone is taking their words as absolute truth. But words, most of the time, are the ego's best shield. We say what we want to be. We stay silent about what we're scared to show. And we dress up what we don't even want to admit to ourselves. So when you only follow what someone says, you risk falling for a reflection. But when you pay attention to what goes unsaid, what keeps repeating, what makes them uncomfortable, you start to see the real person underneath. And strangely, that's where real connection begins. Because the most honest kind of closeness doesn't come from performance. It comes from what doesn't need to be faked. In that way, reading someone isn't about reducing them. It's about disarming your projections. Most of our pain in relationships doesn't come from who the other person really is. It comes from who we needed them to be. What hurts isn't always betrayal, it's the shattering of illusion. And illusion only survives when we look at people through desire instead of attention. That's why people who learn to read others also learn to let go earlier. Not out of bitterness, but like someone pulling back the curtain and finally seeing the shape of what's been there all along. Here's the strange part. The more accurate your reading becomes, the more compassionate your gaze gets. Because understanding someone doesn't mean excusing them, but it does shrink the need to hate. When you realize someone is acting from a wound, from fear, from insecurity, judgment loses its grip. Not because you're soft, but because you no longer need to be angry to walk away. Understanding is enough. Detachment is enough. And that's a kind of power that doesn't need to shout. There's a quiet kind of wisdom that's born from pain but grows in silence. Comes after trusting too easily. After hearing beautiful words that never matched reality. After giving second chances that only helped someone polish their disguise. This wisdom doesn't make you cruel, but it does make you slower. More selective. You stop rushing in. You stop getting high on promises. You watch. You wait. And while you wait, you see. Not because you're paranoid, but because you know. When pressure hits, the soul always shows its architecture. And when you get to that point, you stop being a victim of appearances. Not because you're smarter, but because you don't need the other person to be perfect in order to value them. You don't need their admiration to feel worthy. Your power isn't in controlling anyone. It's in not depending on anyone's image of you or their image of themselves. And that kind of freedom, even when it gets lonely, is the only foundation for something real. Something that doesn't require you to perform, translate yourself, or fear someone walking away the moment they see your cracks. The irony is this: the clearer you see others, the more clearly you start seeing yourself. And that, while uncomfortable, is what makes you dangerously awake. Because once you've truly read yourself, you stop needing so much protection. And without all that armor, you can look directly. You can understand without worshipping. And choose without building castles in the air. What we call emotional intelligence, from this perspective, isn't about being ultra-sensitive. It's about perceptive precision. The ability to listen without getting swept up by someone's words. To observe without needing to explain everything through affection. To connect without losing your grip on reality. And that precision, when cultivated slowly, patiently, becomes a silent weapon. Because the one who sees clearly chooses freely. And the one who chooses freely doesn't need anyone else to rescue them. They've already learned how to rescue themselves. There comes a point in life when you no longer try to understand others to protect yourself from them, but to stop hurting yourself through your own illusions. Because it's not the other person who wounds you, it's your need for them to be different, better, more noble, more honest, more loyal. The deepest pain doesn't come from someone else's betrayal, but from the mirage you built out of desperation. Learning to read someone isn't about gaining control. It's about surrendering to what is. Accepting that clarity hurts less than hope when hope is built on fiction. Machiavelli understood this long before most. He knew the problem wasn't human malice, but the willful blindness we choose in order to avoid seeing it. The resistance to accept that behind beautiful speeches and proudly held principles, there are survival mechanisms, urgent needs, fears dressed up as virtues. That's why his perspective was never desperate. It was clear. And it's that clarity that still makes people uncomfortable. Because it asks us to let go of the comfort of idealism. To stop expecting people to act in line with our moral expectations. Instead, it invites us to see them as they are, in their rawness, in their strategy, in their contradictions. Not to hate them, but to choose more wisely who we give what we can't get back. Our time, our energy, our trust. The sharper your ability to read people becomes, the quieter your disappointment gets. There's no more drama. No anger. No need to explain why someone wasn't what they claimed to be. There's just acceptance. Sometimes even compassion. Because you understand, no one can give what they've never allowed themselves to feel. You can't expect consistency from someone torn between what they want and what they believe they should show. You start to see that most people don't lie out of cruelty, but out of habit. They don't manipulate for fun, but out of fear. And even the most well-intentioned people have blind spots that, when exposed, reveal a version of themselves they're not ready to face. But that doesn't mean we should embrace moral relativism or give up. Clarity isn't cynicism, it's emotional precision. It's seeing without distortion. And from that clarity, you start drawing boundaries that don't need to be loud or defended or explained. Just enforced. A person who's learned to truly see no longer reacts with emotional outbursts because they're not relying on words, they're reading actions, patterns, contradictions. They no longer need proof or excuses or third chances just to prolong the inevitable. They've realized that sometimes the only way to keep your peace is to walk away quietly, simply because you've seen enough. There's something deeply transformative about being able to see without needing to intervene. That ability to read someone and still not try to change them. Just accept them. And calmly decide whether to stay or to leave. That freedom, so distant from the need to be liked, to understand everything, to justify the unjustifiable, isn't something you reach through arguments. You earn it through scars. Only after trusting too much. Only after betraying yourself for someone else. Only after holding on to relationships where you loved the version of someone you created in your mind. Right there, in that crack between illusion and reality, emotional intelligence begins. When clarity stops feeling like punishment and starts becoming your compass. The moment you begin to see clearly, you start losing people. Some won't feel comfortable with your gaze anymore. Because seeing someone without idealizing them makes them uneasy. When you no longer need to dress the truth up, lies start to unravel just by standing in the same room. You no longer play the game of mutual flattery. You don't accuse. You don't hurt. But you also don't engage. You observe. And you choose. Because now you know that the value of a connection lies not in what's promised, but in what survives the silences. In what reveals itself when no one's trying to impress anyone. There's also an unavoidable sadness that comes with seeing like this. A constant kind of mourning for what will never be. For the bonds that dissolve when truth takes the place of illusion. For the versions of people we imagined that never really existed outside of our hope. But that sadness has weight. It makes room for something real. For quieter, more grounded, more honest relationships. Not perfect, just human. And in that humanness,